participation, political participation. What does that mean? I mean, there's the obvious kind of going into the voting booth and pulling the lever. There are more subtle, and some would say less significant, ways of participating politically, whether that means simply liking something on Facebook, sharing something on Twitter, or maybe even more active ways such as actually giving money or donating time or doing something outside of the voting booth that does qualify as some political activity. Certainly for the younger generation, there's initially going to be more of an inclination to take part in those online political participation activities that might not register with us as being very active, whether it's simply sharing something through a social networking site or whatnot. I think the bigger question, and something that researchers are still trying to unravel, is how does that kind of more subtle, more simple, more base level participation through social networks and that kind of media translate later down the road to greater activity in the voting booth where it ultimately matters. What our research points to is that the preference for online media does seem to indicate a higher level of engagement in all kinds of political participation, voting as well as other forms that happen online. And so that's interesting and significant. And what's especially important here is that we found that this preference not only matters, but this preference for online media matters especially for young adults. And so I think that that's the key here is we need to then untangle what are the ramifications for this as we try to study the relationship between social media and politics in the digital age. So maybe it's that because digital media tend to be more interactive, tend to offer more opportunity for an active kind of participation with the news, perhaps it is associated or facilitates a certain kind of activity away from the news in relation to politics. And I think that's what's pretty interesting about this. As media become more digitized and as more and more of our news consumption goes towards these digital platforms, I think the question becomes how do young adults, the current voters and the future voters of America, how do they relate to news depending on how they receive it, through which kind of channel, in what kind of format, whether it comes through more social or traditional channels. And I think for a campaign, I think the big question is if they're trying to reach out to young people, perhaps then there may be less time spent on traditional forms of news and campaigning and so forth, and more emphasis placed on what they can do with digital delivery of messages and getting messages in viral, social, and more networked channels as opposed to simply going through the traditional press to get their message out, especially if they're trying to reach young people.